Hi, everyone, and thanks to Zed Conference for having me and for our friends at EPAM for inviting me. My name is Kieren James-Lubin. I'm the CEO of Block Apps, and I'm here to talk to you about one of our new offerings, Trace Carbon. So Trace Carbon is a sustainability tracking blockchain network by Block Apps, and I'm here today to talk to you about it. So what do we do at Block Apps? We're the leader in enterprise blockchain technology. So our customers range from startups up to very familiar Fortune 500s. And our aim is to allow industries, businesses, and individuals to work better together through our technology, which we call blockchain business networks. So you may have heard about public blockchains, so Bitcoin, Ethereum, etc. We are inspired by these technologies and actually leverage the Ethereum platform as a protocol. However, we focus on the aims of the enterprise. So the big questions for enterprise when it comes to adopting blockchain technology are permissioning and privacy. So who can be in the blockchain network itself? How is the data controlled? And performance. So the public blockchains can handle a few transactions per second, and enterprises often need hundreds or thousands of transactions per second. And so we fix those problems. And also the cryptocurrency itself. So do you need to engage and manage cryptocurrency to use the technology for your normal business purposes, or can you transact in fiat currencies if need be, and manage your operations without exposure to those cryptocurrencies? So that's one of the big differences as well between enterprise blockchain technology and public blockchain technology. And we are squarely in the enterprise camp. So sustainability. Sustainability has a data problem. So you're seeing all the time, big pronouncements from large companies. They'll be carbon neutral by 2030. They've got broad, sweeping sustainability initiatives. There's compensation for executives based on sustainability targets, at least in part. But what does it all mean, and why aren't companies releasing higher quality underlying data? It's a challenge on the investor side from the corporate governance perspective, and really, people don't know what sustainability means for this reason. It's extremely important, but it's a matter of perception versus a kind of standards-based, consistently applicable benchmark that every company can be graded on. More specifically, companies need a secure record of their carbon emissions and offsets that trace back to the source in terms of the activity that the companies are engaging with. So companies are operating increasingly in multidimensional and complex operational ecosystems, many suppliers, many partners, many customers. There's a need to compare between calculated and estimated emissions against actuals. So each company has a forecast, then they actually do something in their operations that may differ from their forecast. It also may differ from what their immediate trading partners report. So in let's say an equipment leasing scenario, do you report the attributable footprint to the equipment the same as the party that leased it to you? And so that kind of touches on the complete provenance of CO2 equivalent emissions and offsets. Who, what, where, and how. So the reporting process is very intensive. There's a lot of manual effort that goes into it, and there tends to be inconsistency in how that reporting occurs. And this all comes back to the shareholders and the public. So I'm fond of quoting that in 2011, 20% of the S&P 500 put out a sustainability report. And in 2021, that number moved to about 90%. So it's a matter of shareholder reporting, but also the public trust. Again, sustainability is extremely important, but the question is, what does it really mean? And how can you prove that from the underlying data in a very complex, interconnected value chain? Sustainability is always in the news. It's across all sectors. So you see, in the oil and gas sector, Exxon getting pressure kind of from the board level, moving towards cleaner energy. Shell was compelled by a court to cut emissions faster than its forecast in a landmark decision that was back in May. You're also seeing large investment efforts. So PepsiCo investing in the largest and most sustainable, in their words, plant in Europe. Actually, food and beverage being, on the one hand, a big source of emissions, but also potentially, at least on the agribusiness side, a big source of offsets. And so, it's on everyone's mind. It's somehow today is the sustainability moment. Everyone from even small companies up to very large companies are thinking much more about sustainability than they were even 5 years ago. And it's coming from all levels, from consumer preference to courts themselves, to the regulators, to the shareholder and board side of the equation. So what are we hearing from the market? And I'll preface this by saying this is not a statistic that you can go Google necessarily. This is something we've heard in our partnership and business development efforts very consistently from large companies. So due to all this public pressure, companies are reporting their emissions reductions and have forecast schedules over which those reductions will occur very publicly. They are nevertheless looking at what they've estimated for their actuals and cutting the reduction estimates by 50%. And the reason is the low confidence, back to the data problem, in all of the data coming from their operational systems, attributable to their partners, and just the lack of a standard, easy to apply methodology to calculate those reductions. And so they've been conservative, but 50% is a big difference, right? It means that it's much slower to meet the targets, and potentially there's a lot of unnecessary expenditure in reducing the footprint beyond where it is today. If you look into what it would take for a, say, large oil and gas company to completely neutralize its footprint, one, there might not be enough carbon offsets out there to purchase. But additionally, a 50% difference would be an enormous number in that scenario. So we're a blockchain company, as we mentioned at the beginning. Why blockchain? So thinking about this data problem, right? What blockchains do at their core is allow secure and auditable data sharing between permissioned parties. So in a public blockchain setting, which is what we don't do, that's more or less everyone in the public blockchain receives all of the data. In a enterprise setting, where you have a number of parties working together directly or in a consortium sort of format, the data is shared on a need-to-know basis. So sort of down to the granularity of a single record, and the record could be a purchase order, a shipment, representing a physical asset of some kind. You can share at a single record level the data in a way that's secure and auditable, but is nevertheless not visible to sort of the whole world. So that's the really big change, and that we're seeing in as business becomes more interconnected. This is more and more necessary to be able to reconcile the set of activity between the internal enterprise and all of the external partners. So it also helps with data modeling. So there are many industry standards. Trace carbon is standards agnostic, but you have to use something to calculate the CO2 equivalent emissions profile of the enterprise. And so it allows companies to sort of agree by supporting a number of standards by usage versus kind of waiting for a long time for, there'll probably never be a single standard, for instance, for sustainability reporting. We support all of the popular methods, and you can kind of mix and match as you go and reconcile with your trading counterparties as well. So blockchains actually work very well with the existing enterprise IT stack. through a mix of API integration and just supporting, again, standard data models that ERPs, for instance, have. It actually works very well to meet enterprises where they are. And at the same time, it's very extensible. So blockchain smart contracts allow new data models, new data sources to be onboarded very easily, new business workflows. And so the system is much more extensible to an end user than most sustainability focused products. And finally, analytics and reporting. So having cleaned all of the data in the enterprise and also reconciled all of it across trading parties, you have a much more accurate kind of pane of glass on your business operations, and this allows you to support your strategy as you can find insights which can guide the path towards which remediating action, for instance, to take in service of your sustainability goals. So back to Trace Carbon. So Trace Carbon is an enterprise blockchain network that enables compliance and transparency and traceability through the CO2 emissions ecosystem, with corporate reporting as a key use case, but also project effectiveness and product lifecycle analysis. So corporate reporting, this is the question of, okay, so I'm probably a large enterprise. I need to understand what my footprint is. First, that's a starting point before embarking on particular remediating actions. Where am I today? Project effectiveness allows you to sort of take on a remediating action and evaluate it for its effect. And product lifecycle analysis is similar, but concerns everything that happens to a product from original manufacturer through distribution in the value chain and kind of onwards, including attribution of the footprint kind of at each step along the way. And Trace Carbon, of course, will run on the world's first net zero emissions blockchain. So our blockchain platform does not require mining, which mining is, you may have heard in kind of from the Bitcoin world. It's a means of getting agreement on the state of the ledger, but it's very energy intensive. And given that we are working with businesses, we can change the consensus algorithm to be something that's much more performant and less energy intensive. So just kind of a picture of the Trace Carbon ecosystem. So if you think about your position in the value chain, so there'll be parties upstream of you and downstream. You have your scope 1, that's your direct footprint, that's what's attributable to your internal operations, and your scope 2, but also more importantly 3, that's your indirect. So that's with your external parties that again are either they could be shipping raw materials to you, they could be buying your more finished products, etc. This all contributes to your overall footprint. And Trace Carbon reconciles again the data across all of scope 1, 2, and 3. So in the case of corporate reporting, how does it actually work at a kind of more granular level? So the kind of core concept is an activity. So activity can be any level of granularity. It could be something restricted to a single factory, for instance, or even smaller than that. An airline flight, like that's an activity or type of activity, or something as large as regional operations for a large construction company, for instance. So it's as granular as you like. You can make activities out of existing activities and roll them up. And so there's going to be an emission/offset associated with an activity, a source. What is it attributable to? Is it internal? Is it a particular business unit within the company? Is it external? There's geographical tagging, for instance, and then a conversion basically to a CO2 equivalent footprint. So there are different methodologies that we support to do this calculation. And with each data point coming from the original data source, you do this conversion. So under the bucket of an activity, so an activity might be flying an airline, getting on an airline. There would be specific flights that happen, so input events. That's what's meant by an input event. And there'll be a sort of single rule to roll up the footprint of all the different flights, and that'll happen kind of automatically through the system. Also, if necessary, by manual data ingest. We prefer to pull data from where it is, so that we don't create new manual effort. But if there's no existing system, we can take in, say, a CSV with all the airline flights, ingest that into the system, and then attribute a footprint to all of them, rolled up under that single activity. So there's then internal reporting. So having ingested all the data, applied these rules, you can break down the total CO2 equivalent emissions and then view it by source, activity, and similarly for offsets. And it also just view how it changes if there are different conversion rules applied, etc. And it all links back to those original data sources. And then finally, you can publish reports out of the system. So this could be to the public. This could be to other groups from within a single enterprise. It could be for the shareholders. And if it's a private company, it might be not for the public. And so this is just summary reporting after we've collected all of this data, and then verification of each step as you go, and a link to share that information. So I'll talk quickly about our launch partners for Trace Carbon as well. Again, this offering has been in the public for about 2 weeks now. So first, we'll talk about CarbonSig, make emissions visible. And CarbonSig is a product of Carbon Finance Labs, which is part of Occidental's Low Carbon Ventures business unit. So think of CarbonSig as adding a label to a product. So just as there are mandates for nutrition labels on the food products that we consume, similarly there are we envision, and we're seeing increasingly the case, that products themselves will actually start to be labeled. In some cases with constituent ingredients and all that sort of thing, but also with their just CO2 equivalent footprint. So here's a calculation for a particular process that would be attached to an actual shipment. And so there's recording the equivalent footprint, managing it in terms of offsetting with credits, and declaring, and then using the underlying blockchain technology, transferability as well. So there are, you see the kind of transactional accounting of this activity is sort of as important as the production of, in the sort of process itself, in the attribution of the footprint and who that belongs to, basically. So, you have different cases of transfers here. It could be the purchase of carbon offsets. It could be, money flowing on one hand, and, the footprint in the actual product going the other way. And again, will come attached to it much more detailed information on what happens to that product in production than has been available to date. So, and they actually used the product for a negative CO2 equivalent shipment going into the production of a zero CO2 water bottle they did with one of their really big trading partners, another very large oil and gas company, and I think facilitated by a few of the banks that get involved in this situation. So this custody report is real and neutralized, or it's part of the neutralization calculation for a big shipment they did some months back. So that is CarbonSig, again, the label for your products in terms of carbon intensity. Our second launch partner for Trace Carbon is called Field Trust, Powering Better Decisions. Their products help customers be compliant with various voluntary and then state-sponsored initiatives that you see below, notably kind of the Sea Cargo Charter and the Poseidon Principles. Those are actually focused on, everything Field Trust does is focused on fuel, obviously, and maritime fuel being about 1/8 of the consumption of all fuel worldwide, if I got that number correct. The Sea Cargo Charter and Poseidon Principles, actually, they focus on the financing side. So, shipping is very expensive, and so it needs a certain amount of credit, and these both of those have various principles whereby borrowers will either pay higher interest or not even be offered financing if they do not meet certain sustainability targets. And again, this is so some of these are voluntary initiatives. Some of them are parts of government or quasi-government bodies, but all of them are pushing everyone really, from the financing to the shippers to the carriers or logistics providers themselves in a sustainable direction. So Fuel Trust is very timely as far as addressing this large market that's moving this way kind of on its own. So the way the Fuel Trust system works and how it interfaces with trace carbon is sort of as you see here. So Fuel Trust is a proprietary system to analyze fuel itself, and fuel, while it is a commodity, it actually is unique enough that you can fingerprint it, starting with the processes at the fuel producer level and the data that they're collecting. Fuel Trust basically is an engine to assess that data and uniquely fingerprint the fuel using some AI and machine learning technology. And as the fuel reappears sort of later in the value chain, they're able to identify it as well, even at an admixture level, basically. So that's what analyze and predict carbon potentials and then determine and validate emissions actuals sort of means. This means they're kind of following the fuel through the value chain, and as they have more data on the input side, they're more able to identify fuels and a mixture downstream as well. So we're kind of generally seeing a trend towards decommoditization, whereby even products thought of as completely equivalent or close to completely equivalent are starting to be more uniquely identifiable back to the original manufacturer and then through the process as different manufacturing steps have occurred. And so trace carbon is tracking sort of all of the activities to the point before. So what are all the things that happened through this value chain, whereas Fuel Trust is dealing with the physical product itself, which is from a sort of digital fingerprinting methodology, if you will, which trace carbon is agnostic to and just sees as another methodology, another data input to the system. And one thing I'd like to mention about Fuel Trust, so often it's the case that everyone in the value chain is actually doing better than what let's say the EPA estimate for the CO2 equivalent emissions coming from a barrel of crude is, for instance, because in essence that they do the most conservative calculation, and for obvious reasons, where fuel producers are starting to be able to optimize for a lower overall footprint, and they're not necessarily getting credit for that if they don't employ a methodology like Fuel Trust, which analyzes the actual fuel itself versus just applying sort of a formula that applies to all fuel. So I suppose I said a lot of what's on this side here, but so basically Fuel Trust is validating the carbon visibility as it goes all the way through the model and comparing against, let's say, the EPA model, the EU's MRV model, et cetera. And the way they do it is via this combustion analysis that I was describing, validating kind of the inputs and outputs at each stage through the value chain. And this is helping everyone through allowing companies to optimize on the one hand, preparing their reporting, helping with tax compliance, especially in Europe, and just at the end of the value chain, making visible all of the ESG parameters that happened all the way through. So again, they're doing this by looking at the underlying product itself. We are supporting this by being the consistent, validated cross-company record of all of the activity that occurred. And so it's a very synergistic partnership. So, bringing it back home, it's chaos, right? There is this tremendous push towards sustainability. lots of data sources, many different methodologies, standards-based methodologies of different types, some pushed by regulatory bodies, some independent actors, some of the more NGO type. No real consensus on which to use, so you have to kind of support them all. Not a lot of traceability in operations, and there's low trust in the numbers that are reported, very low. And again, from the shareholder side, from the consumer side, from the regulatory / even the courts, there's just not a lot of understanding of what's going on. So we're here sort of to solve that problem, and starting with your company. So thinking about understanding your footprint first, and then branching out kind of into with partners like CarbonSig, like Fuel Trust, understanding your footprint, figuring out what's attributable to your partners, your vendors, your customers, automating this whole process, and eventually gaining the public trust. So that's all for today. Thank you very much. You can check out Trace Carbon at blockapps.net/tracecarbon. I'm Kieren James-Lubin, founder and CEO of Blockapps. Thanks for having me.